Can I sit with you, please?
Of course you can.
I need to tell you about my father.
The Lake Forest Academy cafeteria is the loudest room in Chicago. 400 students, old money, new power. The carefully hidden children of people whose names you'd recognize. All of them talking, laughing, completely unbothered by a world that would terrify them if they ever actually saw it. Nobody noticed the woman in the red suit sitting alone at the far end of the longest table. That was exactly how she wanted it. Ora Vance, substitute teacher. Apple in one hand, papers in the other. She had cataloged every exit, every blind spot, and every expensive lie in that room before the lunch bell finished ringing. Invisible by design, unreachable by choice. She was not supposed to feel anything today. Then the room shifted. Not loudly, just a subtle ripple, the way water moves when something dangerous changes direction beneath the surface. Students stepped aside without knowing why. Conversations dropped half a syllable, and a 10-year-old boy in a dark green blazer with a gold K crest walked the entire length of that table. Alone, holding his lunch tray with both hands like it was the only thing keeping him steady. He stopped directly in front of her and stood there, completely still, completely serious, with eyes that were ancient and exhausted, and carrying a weight that would have broken most grown men. He waited. She looked up, and something in her, something she had spent years burying under contracts and clean exits and professional distance, recognized exactly what she was looking at. A child who had run out of safe people. "Can I sit with you, please?" She almost said yes, simply because he asked, so quietly. Then he leaned forward just slightly and whispered 6 words that stopped her cold. "I need to tell you about my father's tea." 400 people in that room. Not one of them noticed the exact moment Ora Vance's carefully constructed invisible life changed direction forever. But she did. And somewhere across the city, in a penthouse 42 floors above Chicago, a man who trusted the wrong woman poured himself a morning cup of tea. And drank it. If you've ever wondered what happens when the loneliest child in the most dangerous city in America chooses exactly the right stranger to trust, you're in the right place. Subscribe and stay close. This story is about to cost you something, and it will be worth every single penny. Ora didn't sleep that night. She sat in her bare substitute teacher's apartment, nothing personal, nothing that couldn't be packed in 4 minutes, and stared at the wall with the stillness of a woman whose entire operational reality had just been rearranged by a child's whisper. The assignment was clean: corporate surveillance. 2 weeks. Watch a rival family's accountant document the paper trail disappear. No complications, no attachments, no exceptions. That was before 6 words changed everything. She pulled Minji's thread the only way she knew how. Quietly, surgically, from the outside in. Morning surveillance, drop-off line. 7:43 a.m. without variation. Champagne coat, perfect composure. The rehearsed warmth of a woman who had practiced devotion until it became indistinguishable from the real thing. She handed a private vacuum flask to Daehyun's driver with both hands. A small, intimate gesture that read as love. Nobody questioned it. Nobody would dare question the boss's future wife. Ora photographed the flask from 4 angles, ran the plates. The registration traced cleanly to a Gold Coast address. But the insurance policy was underwritten by a shell company registered in Taipei. Not Seoul. Taipei. She stared at that word on her screen for a long time. Taipei didn't mean jealousy. Taipei didn't mean a desperate woman protecting her future. Taipei meant infrastructure. Taipei meant financing. Taipei meant someone had built this operation from the outside, inserted it carefully into the most dangerous household in Chicago, and given it a beautiful face and a warm smile. and a private flask. And a 10-year-old boy had been the only one paying close enough attention to notice. She closed her laptop, sat in the dark, thought about a child holding a lunch tray with both hands like it was the only thing keeping him steady. She opened her laptop again. She arrived at school the next morning running on 3 hours of sleep and a decision she hadn't fully admitted to herself yet. The assignment was supposed to end in 2 weeks. She was already planning for 6. She unlocked her classroom, set down her bag, reached for her grade book, and stopped. Her desk drawer, the one she locked every single evening without exception, force of habit, unbreakable routine, was slightly open. She hadn't left it that way. She looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Not from fear, from the particular controlled stillness of a woman calculating every possible explanation and eliminating them one by one. Then she opened it slowly. Inside, sitting perfectly centered on her gradebook, placed there with deliberate, careful precision, was a folded square of notebook paper, child's handwriting. 3 words. She saw me. Somewhere in this building, a 10-year-old boy had just told her 2 things at once: that he was still watching and that he was already running out of time. Aura kept Kale after class under the cover of extra tutoring. He sat across from her quietly, the way children sit when they are deciding whether an adult is actually safe, testing the silence, measuring the distance, looking for the crack in the face that tells them this is just another person who will smile and nod and ultimately do nothing. She didn't rush him. She just opened her gradebook and started writing, giving him time, giving him space, letting him arrive at the decision himself. 3 minutes passed. Then he reached into his blazer pocket and placed a tiny sealed Ziploc bag on her desk. The kind a child improvises from a sandwich bag and tape. Inside, residue scraped carefully from the bottom of his father's morning cup before the kitchen staff washed it. He had been waiting for someone to give it to. She looked at the bag, then at him. His face was completely still, the practiced stillness of a child who had learned very early that showing too much got you nowhere. "How long have you been collecting this?" she asked quietly. 3 weeks, he said. Nobody else looked at the cup. She got it to her forensic contact within the hour. The result came back before midnight. Slow-acting organophosphate compound. Tasteless, odorless, cumulative. At the current dose rate, neurological failure within 60 days. Presenting as stress-related breakdown. The kind powerful men were too proud to report until it was too late. Deliberate, patient, surgical. This wasn't jealousy. This was a trained operation. Aura sat in her car in the empty school parking lot and stared at the result on her screen. The city hummed indifferently around her. Somewhere across Chicago, a man was sleeping beside the woman slowly killing him, and his 10-year-old son had scraped residue from a cup with a plastic spoon, sealed it in a sandwich bag, carried it to school in his blazer pocket for 3 weeks, and waited. Waited for one person to look at him like he wasn't crazy. Waited for one person who wouldn't do nothing. She put the car in drive. She pulled Minji's full background next and hit a wall. Her entire identity before 4 years ago was immaculate. Every record crisp, every reference warm, every photograph perfectly time-stamped. Employment history clean, education verified, family documented. Nobody's past was this clean unless someone had built it for them. She picked up her phone and called the one person who would know. The line connected. Silence. Then, "Where did you find this name?" The forensic contact's voice had changed. In 12 years, Aura had never once heard him sound afraid. He sounded afraid now. The school parent charity brunch was exactly the kind of event Aura hated. Expensive flowers, practiced smiles, a room full of powerful people performing warmth at each other, while their security teams stood at the perimeter and watched everyone's hands. She had 45 minutes to switch the boss's cup. Minji arrived at 9:12 a.m. in a cream dress that cost more than Aura's monthly rent. She moved through the room with the fluid ease of a woman who had been trained to belong everywhere. Greeting parents, charming teachers, laughing at precisely the right moments. The flask transfer happened at 9:23 a.m., discreet, practiced. Minji handed it to the catering lead personally, a man Aura had already made as part of the operation. He would ensure the correct cup reached the correct table. Daehyun arrived at 9:31 a.m. The room changed when he walked in. Not dramatically, just a subtle compression, like the air itself was making room. Conversations shortened, postures straightened. Even the most powerful parents in Chicago recalibrated slightly in his presence. He was tall, composed, dressed with the quiet confidence of a man who had never once needed to announce himself. He moved through the room greeting people with the measured warmth of someone who had learned long ago that real power never raises its voice. Aura watched him from across the room and thought, this man has no idea. She had 90 seconds, one opportunity, zero margin for error. She engineered it perfectly. A knocked tray near the refreshment table, a cascade of genuine-sounding apologies, a brief, beautiful moment of orchestrated chaos that drew every eye in a 10-foot radius, including the catering leads. The cup switch took 4 seconds, clean, invisible, the kind of move that takes a decade to make look accidental. Daehyun drank the clean cup. He didn't know. Minji didn't know. His head of security, a broad, watchful man named Director Shin, gave Aura a long, flat look that she filed away carefully. Not suspicious yet, but noticing. Director Shin was the kind of man who made a habit of noticing. She returned to her seat, picked up her coffee, kept her breathing even, then felt it. Eyes on her. She looked up slowly. Daehyun was watching her from across the room. Not the polite, glancing awareness of a man scanning a crowd. Something more deliberate, more focused. The quiet assessment of someone who had just noticed a piece that didn't fit the board. He held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds, then looked away. As parents filed out, he paused beside her chair, set down a plain white card, blank except for a handwritten number. Didn't look at her. "Careful, Ms. Vance," he said quietly, already walking away. "This school has very long memories." The meeting request came through the school office at 8 a.m. Mr. Kong requests a private conference regarding Kale's academic progress. 3 p.m., Conference Room B. Aura read it twice, set it down. Read it once more. He was running her. She knew exactly what this was. The card, the look across the brunch room. And now this, a controlled environment, his choosing, framed as something innocent. He wanted to see how she moved when she knew she was being watched. She arrived 2 minutes late, deliberately. His security swept the room before she sat down. 2 men, efficient, thorough, professional. They checked the windows, the adjoining door, the ventilation panel above the whiteboard. Amateur location, she noted. 3 exit points he hasn't covered. Daehyun was already seated when she entered. No jacket, sleeves pushed to the forearm. The deliberate informality of a man who wanted her to underestimate the precision behind the casual. She didn't. He studied her the way a chess player studies a piece that moved when it wasn't supposed to. Quietly, thoroughly. Without any of the social performance most people used to fill silence. She let the silence sit. "You're not a teacher," he said finally. Not a question. "I substitute," she said. "It's temporary." "Everything is," he said. He didn't push further. He was a patient man. She could see it in the way he held stillness without discomfort. He would run her name tonight, her plates, her last 3 addresses. What he wouldn't find was anything real. She was a ghost by design, every record clean, every trail cold. Just like Minji. The thought landed uncomfortably. He asked 3 questions about Kale's progress. She answered them with the right blend of professional warmth and specific detail. He listened with his full attention, the kind of listening that missed nothing. Then she saw it. Through the glass partition behind him, Kale, sitting in the corridor outside, watching his father talk to her. He wasn't doing homework, wasn't looking at his phone. He was completely still, hands folded in his lap, watching with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Hope. Fragile, terrified, desperate. The expression of a child watching 2 people he needed stand in the same room for the first time and praying with everything he had that neither of them ruined it. Something tightened in her chest that had no business being there. The meeting ended. She stood. He stood. "Thank you for your time, Ms. Vance," he said. She nodded, turned to leave. "He talks about you," Daehyun said quietly behind her. She stopped but didn't turn around. "Kale, he talks about you." That evening, her surveillance receiver picked up a fragment of a coded transmission on Minji's driver's frequency. One phrase before encryption swallowed it whole. "The teacher is a problem. Handle it before the school event." 3 days. She had exactly 3 days. The blizzard hit Chicago at 11 p.m. By 6 a.m., the academy was locked down, roads closed, response teams grounded, the city buried under 18 inches of silence. Parents had been notified. Students were confined to dormitories. A skeleton staff moved through the corridors, keeping everything calm and orderly. It was the perfect conditions for what came next. Aura saw the first one at 7:14 a.m. Service entrance, East Wing. A man in a maintenance uniform who moved with the particular economy of someone who had rehearsed the route. She clocked the tell immediately. He checked sightlines before corners. Civilians didn't do that. She was already moving. She found Kale in the dormitory common room, sitting alone by the window watching the snow. She crossed to him quietly, crouched to his level, kept her voice completely even. "We're going to the library, right now. Stay close." He looked at her face and stood up immediately without a single question. Good kid. The library was exactly what she needed. High ground, single choke point entry. Heavy oak furniture. A service corridor behind the reference section that didn't appear on any building blueprint because she had found it herself on day 2. She positioned Kale behind the reference desk, stacked 2 dictionaries and a filing box beside him without explaining why. "Stay here no matter what you hear," she said. "Don't move until I come back." "Okay," he said. Then quietly, "There are 6 of them." She stopped, looked at him. "I counted," he said simply, when they came in. 6 professionals, coordinated, equipped, working a blizzard window with military precision. They had the floor plans, the staff rotations, and a clean extraction route already mapped. What they didn't have was her. She went to work. Sprinkler trigger in the east corridor, drove 2 of them into the open. Fire door hydraulics in the service wing, separated the team's communication. The maintenance corridor gave her angles they couldn't account for because they didn't know it existed. One by one they went quiet, not dead, contained. Professional courtesy. The last man, zip-tied to a radiator in the boiler room, looked up through a swollen eye with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite respect. "Lady," he said carefully, "we weren't sent by the rival crew." She waited. "We were sent from inside the syndicate." Someone who said the boy's mother. The fire alarm detonated through the building. She looked at the ceiling, looked back at him. He was still talking, but the alarm swallowed every word. Outside, through the frosted boiler room window, she could see headlights cutting through the blizzard. Daehyun's motorcade, already through the gate. She walked back to the library. Kale was standing beside the reference desk, not hiding, waiting. He looked at her face, then at her hands, then back at her face. Then he walked forward and pressed his forehead against her arm. He knew. He had known all along. He just hadn't known how to warn her without her leaving. Daehyun walked into the library and stopped. 6 professionals, arranged with unsettling neatness along the far wall. Zip-tied, contained, alive, but only just. His head of security swept the room in 4 seconds and reached for his weapon. Daehyun raised one hand. The room went absolutely still. His eyes moved slowly across the scene. The sprung fire door, the displaced furniture arranged into a deliberate choke point, the improvised restraints, the precise, considered, terrifyingly efficient architecture of what had happened in this room. Then he found Aura, red suit, jaw bruised, left hand wrapped in torn curtain fabric, standing at the far end of the room with his son asleep against her shoulder. Finally, completely, utterly at rest. Something moved behind his eyes that he didn't allow onto his face. He crossed the room, looked at her steadily. Who sent you? Nobody you know. I know everyone in this city. Then you've been moving in the wrong circles. The penthouse was 42 floors above Chicago. His personal physician saw to her hand while his security swept the building floor by floor. He dismissed everyone by midnight, every lieutenant, every guard, every staff member, until the vast apartment held only the 3 of them and the city glittering silently below. He sat across from her at the kitchen island at 2 a.m., didn't debrief her, didn't interrogate her, just poured 2 cups of tea. From a clean kettle she watched him fill himself and set one in front of her. Then he reached across and cleaned the cut above her eye with the focused, careful attention of a man who didn't know how to be gentle in most rooms, but was trying very hard in this one. She let him. She wasn't entirely sure why. Kale wandered in at 2:30 a.m., half asleep, hair displaced, blazer gone. He climbed onto the stool beside Aura without a word or a question, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Daehyun looked at his son. Really looked at him, not the distracted glance of a busy man, not the measured assessment of a boss checking on an asset. He looked at his son the way a father looks when he suddenly understands he has been in the same room as someone's pain for months and never once stopped moving long enough to see it. The specific, devastating heartbreak of a powerful man realizing his child found safety in a stranger because he had failed to build it at home. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Aura saw it, said nothing. At 3 a.m., her phone vibrated on the countertop. She glanced at the screen. Her handler, 4th attempt. She turned it face down. On the 5th attempt, he left a voicemail. She listened to it on the balcony, with Chicago 42 floors below her. You have 24 hours to extract, he said, or we do it for you. She stood there for a long time. Behind the glass, Kale had fallen asleep with his head on the counter beside a man who was still being slowly poisoned and didn't know it. She went back inside. The call came at 6 a.m., her forensic contact. 3 words before anything else. It's been escalated. She was already sitting up. He walked her through it quickly and clinically, the way people deliver information when the information is too dangerous to carry slowly. The accumulation rate had changed over the last 72 hours. The compound in Daehyun's system had reached a threshold. One more standard dose would tip it past the point of natural recovery. Cardiac presentation. Clean. Irreversible. A grieving fiancé. A clean inheritance. A syndicate without its dragon. When? Aura asked. Next administration. Could be this morning. She was dressed in 90 seconds. The penthouse kitchen at 5 a.m. was empty and immaculate. Marble surfaces, steel appliances, a professional setup that a household staff of 4 maintained with military precision. She moved through it the way she moved through every space she had ever worked, reading it, mapping it, understanding its history from its present arrangement. Minji had been here. She found the evidence in 11 minutes. Behind a false panel in the dry goods cabinet, flush with the back wall, invisible unless you knew to look, a second vacuum flask, identical to the primary, preloaded, ready for the morning service rotation when the kitchen staff arrived at 6:30 a.m. She photographed everything in place, angles, distances, timestamps. Then she extracted a sample with the kit she carried, the way most people carried aspirin. Replaced the flask with an identical vessel she prepared herself. Green tea, clean water, nothing else. The switch took 8 seconds. Then she stood in the dark kitchen and didn't move. Because she had everything, the sample, the photographs, the timeline, the Taipei connection, the hit squad from yesterday. All of it assembled into something so complete and so damning that no reasonable person could dispute it. She had everything she needed. And she knew exactly what came next. What came next was a 10-year-old boy's world breaking open all over again. His father's face when he understood. The specific kind of devastation that hit men who had built everything on their own judgment and discovered it had been used against them. She stood in the dark kitchen and gave herself exactly 60 seconds to not want to do this. Then she heard footsteps. She turned slowly. Daehyun was standing in the kitchen doorway, dark, still, watching her with the flask in her hand and the open cabinet behind her and 60 seconds worth of evidence arranged on his counter. He didn't reach for anything, didn't call anyone, didn't move. The city hummed 42 floors below them. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet, controlled. The voice of a man holding something enormous at arm's length through sheer discipline alone. How long? She didn't look away. She didn't soften it. She just told him the truth. And watched something in him, something he had built carefully over a lifetime, begin to come apart. She laid it out without pause, the lab results, the accumulation timeline, the Taipei Shell Company underwriting Minji's entire identity, the second flask, the decoded transmission, the hit squad swallowed last words in the boiler room. She placed each piece on the counter between them like evidence on a table, because that was exactly what it was. She didn't editorialize, didn't soften the language, didn't watch his face for permission to continue. He had asked for the truth. This was the truth. Minji wasn't a jealous woman protecting her future. She was the endpoint of a 2-year operation, recruited, constructed, and inserted by a rival faction that had spent 24 months trying to fracture the Kang Syndicate from the outside and failed every time. So they built a door from the inside instead, a complete identity. 4 years of immaculate records, employment, education, family, history, assembled by people who understood that the most dangerous weapon you could place next to a powerful man wasn't a gun. It was someone he loved. The rival faction's plan was precise. The fiancé eliminates the heir first, triggering a succession crisis. Then the boss. The syndicate fractures, fighting over the throne. They walk into the vacuum. Kale had been the first target. Daehyun had been the long game. She finished speaking. The kitchen was completely silent. Daehyun hadn't moved, hadn't interrupted, hadn't looked away from the evidence on the counter. He sat with the particular stillness of a man dismantling the architecture of his own future, brick by brick in real time, and refusing to let a single one fall on his face. Then he asked one question. Just one. Did my son know before you did? Yes, she said. He has been trying to protect you for 3 months, alone, with no one to tell and nowhere to go. He scraped residue from your cup with a plastic spoon and carried it to school in a sandwich bag for 3 weeks, she said, waiting for one person who wouldn't do nothing. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing in the room. She watched it move through him. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet internal rearrangement. The specific, devastating heartbreak of a man realizing his 10-year-old son had been braver than everyone in his entire organization combined. His phone lit up on the counter. Minji. He looked at it for exactly 3 seconds, Then he picked it up. And his voice, when it came, was warm, unhurried, completely, terrifyingly normal. "Where are you right now?" "Stay there. I'll come to you." He ended the call, set the phone face down on the counter, looked at Aura with eyes that had already decided everything that came next. "Take Kale to the East Wing," he said quietly. "Don't come out until I come for you personally." She heard everything that sentence contained, everything it cost him, everything it meant. She took Kale to the East Wing. He came for them at dawn. No knock, just the door opening quietly and Daehyun standing in the threshold, jacket gone, the particular exhaustion of a man who had just closed something permanently, sitting on his shoulders like weather. He didn't explain what happened. He didn't have to. Aura read it in the set of his jaw. Something resolved, something grieved, something irreversible. 3 of the rival faction's Chicago operators would be found later that morning with a kind of stillness that permanently ended all further conversation. Minji would not be found at all. The syndicate held. Kale was awake, sitting at the East Wing window watching the city come alive below, still in yesterday's school blazer, quiet in the way he was always quiet, but somehow different now. Lighter, like something he had been carrying for 8 months had finally been set down somewhere safe. His father crossed the room and sat beside him. Didn't speak, didn't explain, didn't try to compress 8 months of distance into a single sentence, just placed one hand on the back of his son's neck, the way fathers do when every word they know is completely inadequate, and stayed there. Kale closed his eyes. He exhaled like someone who had been holding their breath since September. Aura watched them for exactly as long as it took to understand that this moment didn't need a third person in it. Then she walked quietly to the guest room, picked up her bag, and began moving through the checklist she had run at the end of every job for 10 years. Clean exit. No trace. Vanish. She got as far as the hallway. "Aura." She stopped, turned. Daehyun was standing at the end of the hallway, Kale beside him, awake, still, watching with those ancient, exhausted eyes that had seen too much and were now seeing exactly what they had been quietly hoping for since a woman in a red suit looked up from an apple and didn't look away. "I've spent my life reading threats," Daehyun said. "Every room, every angle, every person who ever came close. I built everything I have on never being surprised." He paused. "I've been drinking poison for months, and I never saw it." "You did." He looked at her not the way he had looked at her across a brunch room, not the way he had looked at her standing over 6 unconscious professionals, the way a man looks at something he has already decided he cannot watch disappear back into the city. "I've been drinking poison for months," he said quietly. "You're the only cure I have left. Stay." She should leave. Every clean professional instinct she had built over a decade said leave. The job was done. The ghost disappears. That was how this worked. That was always how this worked. She looked at Kale. He wasn't breathing, just waiting. The way he had waited at the end of that cafeteria table, holding everything he had in both hands, and hoping with everything he was that she wouldn't walk away. The bag hit the floor, and somewhere in Chicago, in the loudest city in America, a woman who had spent a decade being invisible finally decided to be seen. If this story got to you, if a boy with a sandwich bag and a secret broke something open in your chest, hit subscribe, drop a comment with your favorite moment, and share this with someone who needs a story worth losing sleep over. I'll see you in the next one.